Racist cops wrongfully arrest a black man until he calls his brother, the U.S. Attorney General. In the heart of Baltimore's bustling Inner Harbor district, a police cruiser screeches to a halt. A well-dressed black man stands on the curb, hands in the air, confusion etched on his face. Strangers gather, smartphones recording, whispering in disbelief. An officer barks orders, slams him against the hood, and cuffs him, accusing him of a crime he hasn't committed. Protestations go unheard, overshadowed by rising tension. But this isn't just any injustice. When the man finally makes a phone call, it sends shockwaves through the precinct. Across town, at the U.S. Attorney General's office, an unexpected phone rings, turning this wrongful arrest into a legal earthquake. David Fletcher had no inkling that his life would turn upside down on a Wednesday morning. The day began routinely enough in his modest yet comfortable apartment in Baltimore, Maryland, just a short drive from the iconic Inner Harbor. Awake before dawn, David sipped a mug of black coffee, contemplating the week's workload at his real estate consulting firm. With an important meeting scheduled downtown, he chose his sharpest navy blue suit, hoping to make the right impression on a prospective client. David was known for his diligence, kindness, and business acumen. He had nurtured big dreams since his youth dreams, fueled by the values his parents instilled in him back in their old Chicago neighborhood. Hard work, perseverance, and giving back to the community were cornerstones of the Fletcher household. Those values also shaped David's approach to every aspect of his life, from personal relationships to professional endeavors. That morning, however, the bustling city carried an undercurrent of unease he couldn't quite place. Sirens seemed louder, drivers more impatient, and the hum of the city more urgent. Maybe it's just another busy day, David told himself, pulling out of the garage to navigate the congested streets toward his meeting. Little did he know that 2 blocks away, a high-priority police dispatch call had just come through. A suspect in a recent burglary was believed to be armed and on the run. The suspect's vague description, simply a tall black male, around 30 years old, wearing a dark jacket, was all the officers had. That flimsy lead would soon collide violently with David's morning routine, setting off a chain of events that would upend not just his day, but the entire Baltimore Police Department's reputation. Lombard Street was always congested during rush-hour, cars honking, buses chugging, and pedestrians weaving in and out. David parked his car in a metered spot, checked his watch, and realized he was still early for his meeting. Deciding to walk the final block to the cafe where his client was waiting, he reveled in the crisp morning air. The sun had broken through the clouds, bathing the city's historic row houses and sparkling harbor waters in soft light. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, a sudden commotion caught his attention. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, raced toward him. Pedestrians parted like waves, clearing a path for the vehicles. Without warning, the cars screeched to a stop mere feet away, and 4 uniformed officers jumped out, hands hovering near their holsters. One officer, a tall man with steely eyes, pointed at David. "Hands where I can see them," he barked. Confusion washed over David. He glanced around, wondering if the police were addressing someone else. But no, their eyes were locked on him. David slowly raised his hands, heart thudding against his ribcage. "Officer, is there a problem?" he asked, voice tight with anxiety. "Get on the ground," another officer shouted, stepping forward with baton raised. People on the sidewalk gasped. Some fumbled for their phones, cameras rolling. The tension soared. David remained calm, hoping reason might prevail. "I'm not sure what's going on. I'm just on my way to a meeting." But his protestations fell on deaf ears. 2 officers lunged, forcing him face down onto the concrete. Pain shot through his shoulders as they twisted his arms behind him to fasten handcuffs with alarming force. Somewhere in the swirl of confusion, David heard the dreaded words, "You're under arrest for suspicion of burglary." Shock numbed him. He had no idea that the flimsy description from a recent police bulletin would land him in cuffs, his entire life about to transform in an instant. As David lay pinned to the ground, his cheek pressed painfully against the rough pavement, a swirl of emotions overtook him: confusion, fear, and a twinge of anger. He knew this scene played out far too often in America, an unarmed black man forcibly detained by police under vague or dubious circumstances. Growing up, he'd witnessed countless news reports of similar injustices. He recalled the heart-stopping phone calls from worried friends whenever such incidents dominated the headlines. Nevertheless, he'd never expected to find himself at the center of it. Here he was, dressed in a suit, pinned by uniformed officers who had no qualms about treating him like a hardened criminal. Passers-by watched in horror. Some shouted at the cops, urging them to look closer, to realize they had the wrong man. Others simply stood frozen, phones in hand, capturing every second. "Officer, you've got the wrong guy," David insisted, his voice muffled by the ground. "Check my ID, please." The nearest officer took his wallet but didn't bother opening it. Instead, he stuffed it into a pocket and tightened his grip on David's wrists. "We've got a suspect matching your description. Don't make this harder on yourself," he growled. Another squad car arrived, adding to the chaos, lights cutting through the morning sunlight. The new arrivals rushed over to assist, though it was clear David posed no threat. He was already restrained, breathing unevenly, his impeccable suit torn at the shoulder. An uneasy hush descended. This moment would be crucial. Would the officers continue down a path of gross misconduct, or would someone examine the evidence more carefully? Yet the lead officer didn't seem concerned with nuance. He simply pulled David to his feet and shoved him toward the nearest cruiser. "We'll sort this out at the station," he said gruffly. As he was pushed into the back seat, David's mind scrambled for solutions. He needed to contact anyone who could help rectify this nightmare. If the police wouldn't listen to him now, maybe they'd listen later, but only after the damage had been done. The interior of the patrol car smelled of old vinyl, sweat, and disinfectant. The cage, like divider between the front and back seats, reinforced the feeling of entrapment. With hands cuffed behind his back, David shifted uncomfortably, struggling to catch his breath. He could see outside through the window rows of startled onlookers, phones raised, documenting every second. His mind raced. "This can't be happening. I've done nothing wrong." Yet the throbbing in his shoulders and the sting of humiliation confirmed it was indeed happening. Memories flashed of his mother, lecturing him on how to handle encounters with law enforcement. "Keep calm, don't argue, comply, stay alive." A vital talk in many black households. He had always assumed that talk was crucial, but that with his professional status, the police wouldn't target him. Now that assumption lay shattered. He thought about his older brother, Jerome Fletcher, the man who had soared to national prominence when appointed by the president as the U.S. Attorney General. Jerome had dedicated his career to prosecuting corruption and advocating for equal rights. He was known for his unwavering commitment to justice. But David had never wanted to rely on his brother's position for personal matters. He prided himself on forging his own path. In that police cruiser, though, with panic surging, David realized he might have no choice. Wrongful arrests can spiral out of control, leading to criminal records, reputational damage, or worse. If these cops persisted, how would he reclaim his life? He inhaled, mustering a semblance of composure. "Bide your time," he told himself. "Get to the station, call your lawyer, and if necessary, call Jerome." Slowly, a steely resolve replaced his initial despair. He might be trapped in the back of a police car, but he wasn't powerless. Soon enough, These officers would discover the grave mistake they'd made. The question was, how many people would suffer before the truth emerged? Through the barred window, the city blurred into a tapestry of buildings and traffic lights. The drive to the precinct felt like an eternity, the silence heavy, except for an occasional burst of radio chatter. Every time a new dispatch came over the radio, David half expected the officers to receive a correction that the suspect they had apprehended was, in fact, someone else. But no such message arrived. He peered through the partition at the officers in the front. The driver glanced at his partner, then back at the road. David couldn't see their faces clearly, but he sensed their tension. They likely felt triumphant, having swiftly apprehended a perpetrator. He wondered if they ever paused to question whether they had the right man, or if, in their view, a single shared trait skin color was enough to justify an arrest. Soon, the car pulled into a secured parking area behind the precinct. Its tall chain-link fences and security cameras gave the place a fortress-like appearance. As the officers parked, David braced himself. He knew the routine fingerprinting, mugshots, a humiliating phone call, but none of it should be routine for a person who had committed no crime. The officer who'd pinned David down opened the rear door, yanked him out, and tightened the cuffs again. David grimaced at the pain, but said nothing. He could sense the man's hostility, or maybe it was unbridled pride at having caught someone. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed, and a stale odor of disinfectant hung in the air. Uniformed personnel moved about, some with coffee cups, others carrying case files. A few cast curious glances at David. A well-dressed detainee was an unusual sight, but nobody intervened. The policeman marched David down a corridor to a small processing room where two more officers awaited with fingerprint equipment and a camera. Any hope that a senior officer might step in and rectify the error seemed to fade as David was ushered into the system. The unstoppable machinery of a wrongful arrest churned on, oblivious to truth or justice for now. The processing was clinical and impersonal. A female officer, expression neutral, rolled David's fingers across an inky slab to capture his prints. Each press felt like another step into an unjust labyrinth. Next came the mugshot, a bright flash against a dull grey background. David found it ironic, an innocent man immortalized in a photograph typically reserved for criminals. As soon as they finished, an officer shoved a form at him. "Fill this out," the man said, barely meeting David's gaze. David skimmed the document information about contact details, health history, and personal data. He complied, even though anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. The sooner he cooperated, the sooner he could call his lawyer or, if need be, the one person who might unravel this fiasco in a heartbeat, his brother, the U.S. Attorney General. Once the paperwork was done, David was escorted to a holding cell. The clang of the heavy metal door behind him made his heart jump. The cell was cold, with a cement bench and an overpowering smell of antiseptic. 3 other detainees, 2 men and a woman, lingered on the opposite bench, each looking weary and resigned. David attempted to maintain his composure as the officer left, locking him inside without explanation of how long he would wait. Alone with his thoughts, he wondered about the meeting he'd missed, about clients calling him, about the public humiliation if word spread that David Fletcher was arrested. Would people assume he was guilty, or would they question the system that detained him? As the minutes dragged on, he closed his eyes, trying to quell the storm brewing in his mind. Soon, he would make his phone call, and when he did, the Baltimore precinct's day and possibly their entire department would take a sharp turn. But first, the system had to allow him that basic right. Until then, all David could do was wait, fighting the urge to scream at the injustice of it all. An hour crawled by before a young officer approached the holding cell, keys rattling. He unlocked the door and gestured for David to come out. "Your turn for the phone," he said flatly. David wondered if the officer had any inkling that this phone call could alter everything. He followed the officer down a narrow corridor into a small room with a single phone mounted on the wall. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The officer handed him a slip of paper. "Write down the number you're calling for the record," he instructed. "You get one call." David paused, considering whether to call his attorney first. But in that moment, he realized time was of the essence. This was no ordinary case of needing legal counsel. This was a matter of exposing a deep flaw in the policing system. He would call his attorney eventually, but first, he needed the big guns. He needed his brother. He scrawled the number for the main switchboard at the Point Us Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. The officer's eyebrows rose slightly. "Department of Justice?" he repeated, skepticism dripping from his tone. "You expect me to believe you have business with the DOJ?" David offered a tight smile. "I do." Lifting the receiver, David punched in the number and waited. Each ring echoed in his ear like a countdown to destiny. After a few rings, a crisp, professional voice answered, "U.S. Department of Justice, how may I direct your call?" David inhaled. "This is David Fletcher. I need to speak with Attorney General Fletcher immediately." "It's urgent." The woman on the other end hesitated. "Sir, the Attorney General typically doesn't handle personal calls on this line." "Trust me," David said, mustering every ounce of composure. "He'll want to take this call." Another pause. Then, "One moment, please." As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the tiny room skyrocketed. If the clerk refused to connect him, or if the call was somehow cut off, David's chance at immediate relief would vanish. Yet deep inside, he sensed that fate was aligning to shine a light on this injustice, one phone call at a time. Finally, the line clicked, and a familiar voice came through, slightly harried, but undeniably that of Jerome Fletcher, the U.S. Attorney General. David felt a wave of relief wash over him. "David?" Jerome said, sounding concerned. "What's going on?" David struggled to keep his voice steady, aware the officer stood just a few feet away, likely eavesdropping. "I'm at the Baltimore City Police Department's Central Precinct," David began. "They arrested me wrongfully. They claimed I matched a burglary suspect's description. It's a total mistake." A charged silence hung over the line. Then Jerome's tone hardened. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," David replied, adrenaline still pounding in his veins. "Bruised, but alive." "They pinned me down on the street in front of everyone." "Stay put," Jerome said, voice carefully measured. "I'm going to make some calls. Don't say anything to anyone until I get back to you." "Understood?" David nodded, though his brother couldn't see him. "Understood." Jerome exhaled. "It's going to be fine. I promise." With that, the call ended. David replaced the receiver, aware the young officer's eyes were practically bulging from their sockets. "You actually know the Attorney General?" the officer asked in disbelief. "Yes," David said quietly, handing back the slip of paper. "He's my brother." The officer stared, a storm of confusion and alarm swirling across his face. Without a word, he led David back to the holding cell. Inside, David's heart hammered. Finally, the wheels of higher power were turning. He didn't relish the idea of leveraging his brother's influence, but sometimes shining a bright light was the only way to dispel a darkness that had persisted for far too long. Back at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., Jerome Fletcher was already on his secure line to the Baltimore Chief of Police, setting into motion a confrontation that would test not only the moral fiber of the local precinct, but also the entire system they represented. Within minutes of Jerome Fletcher ending his conversation with David, the Baltimore Police Chief's office phone rang. Chief Benjamin Harlow, a seasoned officer in his late 50s, picked up to hear a calm, commanding voice identify himself as the U.S. Attorney General. Harlow's pulse quickened. "Chief Harlow, this is Attorney General Fletcher," came the firm greeting. "I understand your officers have detained my brother, David Fletcher, on burglary charges. I want clarity on why." "Right," Now, Harlow froze, mind racing. He had no prior knowledge of such an arrest. Attorney General Fletcher, he began cautiously, "I wasn't aware. Let me gather details and get back to you immediately." "No, I need you to investigate personally," Jerome cut in. "I don't want this to be another case of wrongful arrest left unchecked. My brother is innocent." Chief Harlow found his throat dry. "Of course. I'll look into it right away. I promise you a thorough investigation." As soon as the call ended, Harlow summoned his deputy chiefs and demanded records of every arrest made that morning. The precinct logs quickly revealed that David Fletcher had been picked up downtown, allegedly matching the suspect's description in a burglary case. No probable cause beyond a vague physical match was cited, and no weapon was found. The arresting officer's notes were sparse, indicating a hurried decision. Unsettled, Harlow ordered 2 internal affairs detectives to head to the central precinct. Interview the officers, verify the suspect's identity, and figure out what the hell is going on. We do not need a fiasco involving the Attorney General's family. Meanwhile, word of the phone call traveled through the station like wildfire. The arresting officers, led by Sergeant Keith Vickers, exchanged tense glances. If it turned out they'd wrongfully detained the Attorney General's brother, they could face serious repercussions. Still, their pride and biases loomed, and none seemed eager to concede any mistake. In a matter of minutes, the stage was set for a collision of power, principle, and accountability, one that would send shockwaves far beyond Baltimore. Back in the holding cell, David tried to gather his composure. The stares from other detainees felt heavy. They had overheard him mention his brother, the U.S. Attorney General, and some seemed skeptical, others intrigued. One man, with a rough voice and a wary expression, asked, "You really got connections that big?" David offered a polite nod, not eager to discuss his personal life in a cell full of strangers. But part of him sympathized with these individuals, each with their own story. If he was being treated like this, an innocent professional with a direct line to powerful allies, how much worse was it for people with no one to call? Time crept by. Eventually, a female officer approached the cell and motioned for David to come forward. He noticed a small cluster of high-ranking officers at the far end of the hall, whispering among themselves. Tension hung in the air. "Follow me," the officer said tersely. She led him to a small interrogation room, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a fluorescent light overhead. David sat, clasping his still sore wrists. The officer left, locking him inside. The minutes dragged, intensifying his anxiety. Could Jerome's intervention escalate the situation, he wondered. If these officers felt cornered, they might double down on their accusations. Suddenly, the door opened. In stepped 2 plainclothes detectives. Their demeanors were more guarded than aggressive. One introduced herself as Detective Erin Carmichael from Internal Affairs, while the other, Detective Mark Lynn, nodded in greeting. Both appeared serious, but not hostile. "We'd like to ask you a few questions, Mr. Fletcher," Carmichael said, taking a seat. "There's been a development concerning your arrest." David exhaled, relieved at least that someone seemed prepared to treat him as a human being. Whether this was genuine justice or just damage control remained to be seen. Either way, he intended to speak his truth without hesitation. Detective Erin Carmichael flipped open a small notebook while Detective Mark Lynn positioned a digital recorder on the table. David's pulse thundered in his ears as Carmichael gave a slight nod, indicating they were beginning. "Mr. Fletcher," she started, her voice measured, "we've reviewed the arrest report. It says you were taken into custody on suspicion of burglary. Specifically, you allegedly matched a suspect's description in a break-in on Pratt Street earlier this week. Can you share your side of the story?" David glanced at the blank walls. This interrogation room felt so foreign, yet he knew honesty was his best weapon. I was walking to a business meeting downtown when 2 patrol cars pulled up. Officers jumped out, and they ordered me onto the ground. They never asked for my ID or verified anything. They just cuffed me and said I was under arrest. Detective Lynn drummed his fingers on the table. The suspect's description is quite vague, we admit. Tall, black, mid-30s, wearing dark clothing. That's all we have on file. Were you wearing a dark suit? Blue suit? Yes, David replied. Which doesn't exactly scream burglary suspect. Carmichael's brow furrowed. Did the officers mention any reason they believed you specifically matched the suspect? No, not beyond being a tall black male. They didn't even run my identification. Lynn exchanged a glance with Carmichael, then asked, "Did they search you or your belongings?" David nodded. "Yes, one officer took my wallet, but he never opened it. He never looked at my license or business cards." He paused. If he had, he would have seen my name and recognized the obvious mistake. Carmichael leaned back, crossing her arms. "And you were not read your Miranda rights, correct?" David shook his head. "No, they just pinned me down, handcuffed me, and brought me here." The detectives scribbled notes, their expressions betraying a growing unease. David wondered if they were genuinely troubled by what they heard or simply following protocol because of the mounting pressure from above. Regardless, each passing minute brought them closer to a boiling point, the moment when the entire Baltimore PD would have to confront their unambiguous error or risk deeper scandal. As David recounted the humiliating details of his arrest, something monumental transpired outside the interrogation room. Another squad car pulled into the precinct parking lot, carrying a newly apprehended suspect, one believed to be the actual perpetrator of the Pratt Street burglary. This man, later identified as Tony Randall, was neither tall nor wearing anything resembling a suit. Reports indicated he was a short, wiry figure, dressed in a bright red hoodie. Sergeant Keith Vickers, the same officer who'd ordered David's rough takedown, was present when Tony Randall arrived in cuffs. The disparity between Randall's description and David's was glaring. Vickers pretended not to notice. He was still certain he had the right suspect locked in a cell, a suspect who just happened to have a powerful brother. The entire fiasco had become personal for him. Yet word spread swiftly among the rank and file. They nabbed the real burglar. Nervous whispers echoed through the halls. If David Fletcher was innocent, then the police would have to release him immediately and face the wrath of not just the public, but the nation's top law enforcement official, the U.S. Attorney General. Overhearing the chatter, Chief Harlow's phone rang again. He recognized the number on the caller ID Jerome Fletcher's private line. "Heart pounding," he answered. "Chief Harlow speaking." "I trust you have answers by now, Chief." Jerome's voice resonated, steely with expectation. Harlow swallowed hard. "We, do. It appears my officers detained your brother in error. We've just brought in a suspect who actually matches the burglary MO and has confessed in part. I'm taking steps to rectify the situation immediately." Jerome's pause was deafening. "I expect David's release within the hour, and I want the entire chain of events thoroughly investigated." "You understand, Chief Harlow?" "Yes, Attorney General." "Understood," Harlow managed, sweat beading at his temples. He disconnected, realizing that the department's crisis had just transformed into a ticking time bomb. Unless they handled it perfectly, heads would roll. Within moments, a flurry of activity overtook the station. Chief Harlow strode through the corridors, flanked by the 2 internal affairs detectives. They approached the interrogation room where David was being questioned. As the door swung open, David looked up to see the chief's stern face. "Mr. Fletcher," Harlow began, voice wavering between authority and caution. "I'm Chief Benjamin Harlow. There's been a development. Another suspect has been apprehended." Based on new information, it appears we made an error in detaining you. David's jaw tightened. The acknowledgement felt painfully overdue. So I'm free to go? Harlow nodded. Yes, of course. We deeply regret the inconvenience. Inconvenience. The word hung in the air like a bitter joke. David's wrists still ached from handcuffs. His dignity lay in tatters. And here was the police chief using the same hollow language that had been used countless times in other wrongful arrests nationwide. David's eyes narrowed. I'll be leaving now, but this won't end here. Detective Carmichael closed her notebook, an apologetic look crossing her face. We understand if you need to pursue other channels, she offered quietly. David rose from the metal chair, his expression tense. I do. And I will. Sergeant Vickers, standing in the hallway, glared at David but said nothing. Perhaps he was too proud to concede his mistake or too ashamed to face the repercussions. Either way, David wouldn't spare the man a conciliatory nod. As David passed, Vickers muttered under his breath, something inaudible but clearly laced with contempt. David heard the tone, if not the words. Exiting the interrogation room, David walked through the precinct's corridors. Officers parted for him like a tide, whispering and casting furtive glances. In that instant, the policeman's domain seemed reversed. Here was David, holding the moral high ground, while the uniformed men and women cowered in uncertainty. He emerged onto the street, the sun glaring down as though exposing every flaw in the justice system behind him. He had his freedom back, but the scars, both emotional and symbolic, were real. And beyond that front door, a storm was brewing, one that could reshape the Baltimore Police Department forever. The moment David stepped outside, he found himself at the center of a flashbulb storm. News vans lined the curb, camera crews jostled for angles. Someone had tipped off the local stations about a wrongful arrest involving the brother of the U.S. Attorney General, and the media had descended like vultures. Microphones thrust forward, voices shouting questions. Mr. Fletcher, is it true you were arrested without cause? Did the officers know you're related to the Attorney General? Do you plan to press charges? David, temporarily blinded by camera lights, raised his hand to shield his eyes. His mind spun, trying to process the sudden onslaught. He glanced at the crowd, noticing how quickly news spread and how easily the press converged for a sensational headline. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned within him, anger at his treatment, relief at his release, and an emerging sense of responsibility. If he could shed light on systemic failures, maybe that would help others who lacked a powerful relative to bail them out. Clearing his throat, he decided to speak. I was wrongfully arrested this morning, he began, voice quivering slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The police used excessive force and detained me without verifying my identity or probable cause. If they can do this to me, they can do it to anyone. Reporters scribbled notes and cameras rolled, capturing every word. David didn't mention his brother outright. Instead, he focused on a larger narrative, the dangerous implications of racial profiling, the necessity for accountability. I'm safe now, he continued, but there are countless people who experience this kind of injustice every day and don't have the means or the connections to fight back. This needs to change. Questions swelled, but David had said his piece. He gave a brief thanks and then retreated through the throng, heart pounding in his chest. In less than an hour, local news networks ran the story on repeat, broadcast across Maryland and beyond. A single wrongful arrest was fast becoming a national scandal, one that threatened to expose the Baltimore PD's flaws on the largest possible stage. A black sedan with tinted windows slid to a stop at the curb as soon as David broke away from the press. The back door opened, and he slipped inside without hesitation. To his surprise, the driver was a Department of Justice security officer, stoic and silent. Next to him in the back seat sat Jerome Fletcher, the U.S. Attorney General himself. Jerome's eyes flickered with both relief and fury at the sight of his younger brother, scuffed and disheveled. "You all right?" he asked, clasping David's shoulder gently. David nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just." Shaken up. Jerome clenched his jaw. "I spoke to Chief Harlow. They apprehended the real burglar." "This is absolutely unacceptable." Before Jerome could finish, David placed a hand on his forearm. "I'm free now, but this can't just end with me getting out. These officers need to be held accountable, or they'll keep doing this to others." The Attorney General leaned back, gaze distant. "I'm aware. OJ can't meddle directly in every local matter, but we can certainly open an investigation into patterns of civil rights violations. This might be the spark we need to enforce real change in that department." David inhaled slowly, letting the gravity of his brother's words sink in. If Jerome moved forward with an inquiry, it wouldn't just be about one officer's lapse in judgment. It would involve a systematic review of the entire policing culture in Baltimore. "That's bigger than me," David said quietly. "But if it prevents future injustices, I'm for it." Jerome nodded, eyes clouded with determination. "I have to proceed carefully to avoid conflicts of interest, but I promise you, we're not letting this slide. In the meantime, lay low. The media's going to be relentless." As the car pulled away from the chaotic scene, David's mind spun. He had never wanted special treatment, yet here he was, an unintentional catalyst for potential federal scrutiny. One thing was certain: the next few days would be critical for David, for Baltimore, and for a justice system on the brink of a crucial reckoning. Chief Harlow paced the corridor outside his office, phone in hand, sweat forming on his brow. Inside, a group of officers gathered for an emergency meeting to address the fiasco. Sergeant Vickers stood off to the side, posture rigid, face dark with resentment. Word had reached him that David Fletcher was not only freed, but also poised to unleash a chain reaction that could upend careers. "This is out of control," Harlow muttered into the phone. On the other end was the mayor, demanding answers. The chief tried to explain that mistakes had been made, but the mayor's outrage was palpable. With the city already under scrutiny for allegations of excessive force, having the U.S. Attorney General's brother wrongly arrested could be catastrophic. Slamming the phone down, Harlow turned to the assembled officers and supervisors. "We're in damage control now," he announced. Effective immediately, Internal Affairs is launching a formal investigation into the arresting officer's actions this morning. Everyone involved is required to cooperate. Failure to do so will result in immediate suspension. A hush fell. Some officers exchanged nervous glances. Others glowered with thinly veiled defiance, especially those who prided themselves on a tough-on-crime approach. Sergeant Vickers scowled. "We had probable cause," he insisted. He fit the description. Harlow shot him a look. "That suspect you claimed matched the description is 6 inches taller and was wearing a business suit. The actual burglar we arrested wore a red hoodie and stands at 5'8". Explain to me where the probable cause was." Vickers clenched his jaw but didn't respond. The tension in the room thickened. Outside, the station bustled with normal business victims filing reports, officers clocking in for their shifts. But inside these walls, a silent war was brewing, one that pitted the old guard and their questionable practices against a looming wave of accountability. The question now was, which side would Baltimore's police force choose to stand on? 2 days later, the Baltimore Police Department found itself under the glaring scrutiny of national news. CNN, MSNBC, and other major outlets picked up the story of David Fletcher's wrongful arrest. The footage of him pinned to the sidewalk in a business suit went viral on social media, prompting heated debates about racial profiling and excessive force. The Department of Justice did not remain idle. Jerome Fletcher, while recusing himself from direct oversight to avoid a conflict of interest, delegated a team of civil rights attorneys to review the department's past complaints and ongoing practices. The official statement read, "The DOJ is conducting a preliminary inquiry into potential civil rights violations within the Baltimore Police Department, triggered by several recent events and complaints." Public forums erupted, with many Baltimore residents stepping forward with their own stories: unlawful stops, intimidation, unjust searches. This wave of testimonials suggested that David's case was no anomaly. It was merely the high-profile tip of a much larger iceberg. At City Hall, the mayor tried to contain the crisis, calling a press conference. "We are cooperating fully with federal investigators," she said, flanked by Chief Harlow. "Our police force is dedicated to the safety and dignity of all Baltimore residents. Where mistakes are made, we must address them directly." Despite the conciliatory tone, tensions ran high within the department. Officers who felt singled out or scapegoated clashed with those who believed reform was long overdue. Anonymous leaks suggested that certain precincts harbored toxic cultures, with superiors turning a blind eye to misconduct for years. The revelations threatened to tarnish not only the career of Chief Harlow, but also the city's broader reputation. David, meanwhile, found himself caught in a media whirlwind. Though he tried to return to his normal life, camera crews sometimes camped outside his apartment. He received messages, both supportive and hostile, from strangers across the country. In many ways, he had become the reluctant face of a battle for justice, a lightning rod for people's frustrations and hopes. Unwittingly, he had lit a fuse that was now detonating old structures of silence and impunity. Amid the turmoil, Sergeant Keith Vickers refused to back down. Though he'd been placed on administrative leave pending the internal affairs investigation, he still lingered around the station's fringes, stirring resentments among colleagues who felt the department was under siege from politicians and the media. Vickers viewed David Fletcher's wrongful arrest as an unfortunate coincidence, not a testament to deeper systemic problems. Late one evening, Vickers met with two other officers in a run-down diner away from the prying eyes of cameras. Over stale coffee and half-eaten fries, they vented their frustrations. "They're treating us like criminals," one officer hissed. "We were doing our job." Vickers nodded vigorously. "Look, we had to make a quick call. The suspect was described as a tall black male. That's it. We can't be blamed if the description was vague. Now they want to crucify us because he's got a powerful brother." He spat the word "powerful" as though it was a personal affront. His companion, a rookie with big ambitions, looked uneasy. "But shouldn't we have verified his ID?" Vickers shot him a glare. "In the heat of the moment, you don't have time to check ID. We respond to calls. We do what's necessary." Then his tone lowered to a growl. "And we don't let outsiders come in and tell us how to run our precinct." The third officer, older and jaded, merely grunted. "The DOJ investigation's gonna turn everything upside down. They'll want to see old records, old complaints. Some of that stuff we can't let see the light of day." A hush settled over the table. Each man wrestled with his own fears. They knew that if the inquiry was thorough, it might uncover other questionable arrests and use of force incidents. Lives could be ruined, reputations destroyed. Sergeant Vickers slammed a fist on the table. "We stick together, we don't hand them ammunition. I'm not going down alone." In that dingy diner, an informal pact was forged, a last-ditch stand to preserve their version of policing. Little did they know, forces far beyond their control had already begun to expose the very darkness they were so desperate to hide. As the DOJ team settled into a temporary office in downtown Baltimore, phone lines buzzed with whistleblowers and concerned citizens sharing stories of mishandled arrests and intimidation. Investigators sifted through decades of police records, internal complaints, and disciplinary files. Patterns emerged. Repeated instances of certain officers accused of using excessive force, suspiciously few convictions despite multiple allegations, and an internal culture that rarely punished misconduct. Chief Harlow found himself caught in a precarious balancing act. Publicly, he offered full cooperation. Privately, he wrestled with the knowledge that if the investigation dug too deep, it could uncover practices he'd overlooked, sometimes out of ignorance, other times from fear of rocking the boat. In the midst of this chaos, David Fletcher tried to resume normal life, returning to his real estate consulting business. His firm's clients were supportive, but the gossip around his arrest overshadowed his professional achievements. Tired of lurking reporters, he decided to speak openly at a community forum where local residents discussed racial profiling and unjust policing. "I'm not here to demonize every officer," David told a packed auditorium. "Many men and women in uniform serve with integrity. But when mistakes are made, especially those born of bias, the impact ripples through entire communities. If my wrongful arrest can spark change, I welcome it." Applause erupted, but so did dissenting voices. Some in the crowd stood in support, while others complained about the rising hostility toward the police. David remained calm, though tension buzzed. For every person praising his courage, another insisted the police were just doing their job. Meanwhile, inside the Baltimore PD's walls, morale continued to fracture. Younger officers who saw the need for reform whispered among themselves, while older, entrenched figures clung to Sergeant Vickers's mantra, "Defend the status quo at all costs." In effect, both the city and its police force had reached a boiling point. The next steps of the federal investigation promised to determine whether true reform would be possible, or whether Baltimore would remain trapped in a cycle of distrust and secret deals. After weeks of combing through records, the DOJ's civil rights attorneys uncovered a trove of internal documents, body cam footage, and sworn statements from past complainants. They discovered a pattern of discriminatory stops in certain precincts, particularly those led by Sergeant Vickers. In multiple incidents, suspects fitting only a broad or flimsy description, often black males, were detained with unnecessary force. Worse, the documentation sometimes showed that higher-ups within those precincts either downplayed or outright dismissed the complaints. The final straw arrived when one brave officer, Detective Amy Gardner, came forward. She delivered a sealed folder to the DOJ investigators, her personal file of evidence she'd collected over the years. In it were emails, text messages, and meeting minutes revealing how certain supervisors, including Vickers, strategized to hide misconduct. They manipulated official narratives, ensuring that complaints from marginalized communities were labeled unfounded or lost in paperwork. Her testimony painted a damning picture of institutional rot. News outlets pounced on these findings. Headlines proclaimed corruption uncovered in Baltimore PD, accompanied by footage of David Fletcher's wrongful arrest. Social media exploded with calls for the dismissal of high-ranking officials, demands for Sergeant Vickers's termination, and protests outside police stations and City Hall. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was grim. Many officers felt betrayed by the revelations, shocked that such blatant wrongdoing could be carried out in their name. Some called for mass resignations of complicit officers. Others clung to denial, blaming the media and the Fletcher family for tarnishing the department's reputation. Sergeant Vickers was nowhere to be found. Rumors circulated that he'd been placed under formal investigation and possibly fled Baltimore to avoid public scrutiny. Chief Harlow, forced into a corner, announced a major shake-up, temporary suspensions, reassignments, and a vow to clean house. For David, watching these events unfold was both vindicating and unsettling. He had always believed policing could be fair and effective with the right accountability. Now, the meltdown revealed a deeper malaise, one that made his own arrest just one stone in an avalanche of injustices. The question lingered, would the system truly change, or would it retreat into the shadows once the cameras moved on? Less than a month after David's arrest, the DOJ publicly announced a formal civil rights lawsuit against the Baltimore Police Department, citing a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. The lawsuit, in part, was fueled by the revelations tied to David Fletcher's case and the subsequent evidence unearthed. The city faced the prospect of a court-enforced consent decree that would mandate widespread reforms, from training protocols to oversight mechanisms. Sergeant Keith Vickers, the catalyst of the entire episode, was singled out for special scrutiny. Internal Affairs formally charged him with multiple counts of misconduct, including falsifying arrest reports and using excessive force. In a dramatic turn, an internal leak confirmed that Vickers had also directed officers to profile certain ethnic groups. Faced with mounting evidence, he was forced to resign. Criminal charges loomed. A grand jury subpoena hovered. The once confident sergeant now found himself alone, ostracized by the department he had once bullied into complicity. Chief Harlow did not emerge unscathed. While not directly implicated in corruption, his leadership failures were plain. Calls for his resignation intensified. Under pressure from both the mayor's office and the DOJ, he stepped down, acknowledging he had neglected to institute proper checks that might have prevented abuses like David Fletcher's arrest. As for David, he received a personal apology from city officials and a settlement offer for the harm he'd endured. He accepted, with the caveat that the funds be directed toward a new community legal defense fund designed to help those wrongly accused or mistreated. News of his philanthropic choice resonated with communities across Baltimore. In a televised interview, David said, "If one good thing can come from this ordeal, it's ensuring that no one else faces what I faced without the resources to fight back." Meanwhile, Jerome Fletcher maintained a careful distance, upholding his professional obligation not to interfere in the local matter. Still, the case was a reminder that even the highest halls of justice weren't immune to personal stakes. The broader victory lay in exposing systemic issues and forcing reforms that might protect future Davids, those without powerful siblings from the same injustice. In the aftermath, Baltimore's police department began a painful but necessary restructuring. The court-enforced consent decree introduced a civilian oversight board, diversity training, body cam regulations, and strict accountability measures for misconduct. Former officer Amy Gardner, who had courageously shared her evidence, was invited to help shape new internal review policies, ensuring whistleblowers like her wouldn't face retaliation. Community leaders, inspired by David's story, mobilized. Churches, non-profits, and local businesses joined forces to hold neighborhood forums, bridging gaps between residents and the police. The youth of Baltimore, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, demanded real dialogue town hall meetings where they could share concerns without fear. Slowly, trust began to rebuild. Though scars remained, David himself tried to resume normalcy, returning to real estate consulting with a renewed sense of mission. He discovered that many of his clients felt more comfortable discussing their own run-ins with the law or their fears about policing. Through empathy and shared vulnerability, David formed deeper bonds in the city. Business, he realized, could be more than just profit. It could be a pathway to community empowerment. In a final press conference, the mayor, flanked by the new interim police chief and representatives from community organizations praised the city's resilience. She acknowledged the deep-rooted challenges, but expressed hope for sustainable reform. She also publicly thanked David Fletcher for his role in sparking these changes, urging other citizens to speak out against injustice. When asked about his future plans, David simply said, "I'm staying in Baltimore. I want to be part of the solution, not run from the problem." His quiet determination resonated with many who had once lost faith. Thus, the city embarked on a long, winding path toward genuine reform, a path catalyzed by a single wrongful arrest, drastically altered by the phone call to a brother with extraordinary influence, and ultimately propelled forward by a collective will to see justice done. While no one believed the work was finished, they sensed that perhaps, for the first time in a long time, Baltimore's policing culture had a chance at real transformation. And there you have it, the tumultuous story of how a single traffic stop turned wrongful arrest shone a spotlight on deep-seated issues within an entire police department. David Fletcher's quiet dignity and his brother's unwavering resolve ignited a crisis that unraveled corruption, forced high-level resignations, and launched sweeping reforms. From tense standoffs in station corridors to DOJ investigations that rocked City Hall, every step underscored one truth: injustice that goes unchallenged only grows, but when confronted, it can spark a wave of long overdue change. If you found this story captivating and meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more powerful narratives that highlight both our society's struggles and its capacity for hope. Every engagement helps us bring you real-life and fictional accounts of resilience, courage, and transformation. Thank you for watching, and here's to standing up wherever you see injustice, because change begins the moment someone says, "Enough."